54 hours before his daughter's wedding, Norman Pratt was standing at a hotel front desk in Victoria, being told his room no longer existed. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his phone. He asked the young woman behind the counter to open the corporate directory, find the ownership registry for the property, and look at the name of the person listed as beneficial owner. 30 seconds later, the lobby of the Harborstone went very quiet. The house Norman kept in Kingston had a maple tree in the front yard that dropped leaves on the hood of his truck every October, and he never quite got ahead of it. He drove a 2011 F-150 with a cracked left mirror he kept meaning to have replaced. He bought his coffee at the same Tim Hortons drive-thru on Princess Street every morning, and the woman who worked the window had known him for 11 years and believed, not unreasonably, that he was a retired tradesman. She was not wrong about the trades. He had spent 12 years in Northern Ontario, doing everything from framing to finish work before he signed papers on a failing motel outside Sudbury with $40,000 borrowed from 3 different people who had not known what the money was actually for. That was 18 years ago. Crestwood Hospitality Group now operated 11 hotels across Canada, a boutique property in Charlottetown, a conference center in Calgary, and 9 others ranging from Halifax to Kelowna, with 2 new builds in Edmonton and Burnaby under permit. The holding company sat beneath a numbered corporation beneath a family trust registered in his wife's name. Carol Pratt had chosen that arrangement herself in the kitchen of the house in Kingston, 4 years before the cancer that killed her. She had said, "Let Abby have a normal life. Let her earn things. Don't make it complicated." Norman had agreed. After Carol was gone, he kept agreeing on her behalf, which was the only agreement left open to him. Carol had died 37 months ago in an Ottawa hospital room, with Norman holding one hand and their daughter holding the other. She had made 2 requests in her final week. The first was that he eat breakfast before 8 in the morning, which he had managed perhaps 40% of the time since. The second was that he be present, fully present, not half somewhere in his head, for Abby's wedding, whenever it came. He had said he would be. He had meant it the way a man means a thing when the weight of it is still arriving. Abigail Pratt was 28 and went by Abby to everyone who knew her. She was marrying Ben Nakamura on a Saturday in Victoria's Inner Harbor at a property she had chosen 14 months earlier, partly for logistics and partly because Carol had mentioned, once, offhandedly, that it was the most beautiful hotel she had ever seen in a photograph. Abby had arranged the ceremony, the catering, the florals, the rehearsal dinner for Friday evening in the hotel's private dining room. She had asked her father for nothing except to show up. Norman had booked room 408 4 months prior. He had flown out of Toronto on a Thursday afternoon with 1 carry-on and a suit bag, and the confirmation card in his wallet had his name printed in the top corner the way hotel cards do. The front desk associate who looked up the booking was named Zoe Whitman. Her badge read assistant manager, which was 6 weeks into being true. She looked at the reservation, looked at her screen, and then looked at it again with the expression of a person reading a sentence that does not improve on the second pass. She said she was very sorry. She said there had been an accommodation adjustment earlier in the day. She said room 408 was no longer available, but that the hotel had arranged for Norman to be transferred to a partner property on Douglas Street, which was very comfortable, just a 15-minute walk, and that the Harborstone would of course absorb any difference in rate, and Norman asked what had happened to the room. Zoe said the 4th floor had been reserved as a private block for a corporate booking that had come in late. He said his reservation had been confirmed for 4 months. She said she understood that, and that it was deeply regrettable, and that the partner property was quite. Norman said he was not going to the partner property. He said the rehearsal dinner for his daughter's wedding was being held in this hotel's private dining room in under 2 hours, and that he needed to be in the building. He said it without inflection, looking at a point slightly past Zoe's left shoulder, as if reading something on the wall behind her. Celeste Vane was standing near the concierge desk with a tablet and 3 people arrayed around her at varying distances. She was somewhere in her early 40s in a blazer the color of a winter sky, and she moved through a room with the ease of a person who had long since stopped adjusting her path for others. She had heard enough of what Norman said and came over without being invited. She introduced herself and said she was the event coordinator responsible for the corporate block and that she was truly sorry for the inconvenience. The word inconvenience arrived the way it always does when the inconvenience belongs entirely to someone else. Norman said his reservation had been confirmed 4 months ago. Celeste said she understood. She offered to arrange a car to the Douglas Street property. She said her company would cover the nightly rate and a dining credit as well. He told her about the rehearsal dinner. He told her his wife had died 3 years ago, and his daughter was getting married in 46 hours, and this was where the dinner was being held. Something moved across Celeste's face. It did not stay. She offered to cover his room rate outright. Whatever the number was, doubled. Norman looked at her for the first time since she had approached and said no. What followed took 14 minutes, and Norman recognized every step of it the way a man recognizes the mechanics of a system he personally assembled. Celeste made 2 calls. The first was to someone in Crestwood's regional sales division she addressed by first name, someone whose firm routed considerable corporate booking volume through the chain. The second call was shorter. Then a man named Trevor Alcott came down from the mezzanine in a hurry, tablet in hand, mid-40s, with the particular speed of someone who had been told something he was not pleased to have been told. Trevor spoke to Celeste first. Then he went behind the desk and began typing. Zoe said something to him. He answered without looking up. She said something else, and this time Norman caught the last part, which was that the guest had not consented and the booking was confirmed. Trevor said it was under review. He called Norman to the counter and explained, looking at his screen, that a flag had appeared on the reservation. A system discrepancy associated with the payment method on file, a known issue with certain third-party booking batches, and that hotel policy in such cases required holding the booking as provisional pending verification. Norman said the flag had not existed 3 hours earlier when he had received the check-in confirmation text. Trevor said these things sometimes generated late when the daily batch ran. Norman asked whether the flag had been placed before or after the woman in the winter blue blazer had spoken to regional sales. Trevor said he could not discuss third-party arrangements. Norman said he was not asking about third-party arrangements. He was asking about the order in which 2 things had happened. Trevor said the reservation was under review and that pending resolution he could not confirm the room. Norman was quiet for a moment. The clock above the entrance read 5:15. The rehearsal dinner was at 6:30. Abby would be on the 3rd floor right now, in the middle of whatever a person does 2 days before their wedding, and she had texted him at 2 o'clock to ask whether his flight had landed, and he had said, "Yes, on my way." He had not told her what was happening. He was not going to tell her, because she had spent 14 months planning this weekend, and she had asked him for one thing. He thought about calling Sean Moran, who had been his chief of operations for 11 years, and who could resolve a property-level booking dispute in under 7 minutes. He had watched Sean do it. 1 call to Vancouver, and a man would make a call that would end with Trevor Alcott standing in a corridor explaining himself. Norman took out his phone, then he put it back in his jacket. He had built Crestwood on one sentence he had written on the back of a motel receipt in 2007, sitting in a car outside a property in Sudbury whose heating unit had failed and whose night manager had shrugged when he mentioned it. A confirmed reservation is a promise. You do not break it. He had said that sentence in general manager orientations for 18 years. He had put it in the staff handbook. He had repeated it once to a journalist using a different name, and the journalist had not recognized him, which was the point. The principle had come from somewhere real, and the only honest way to know whether it held was to be inside the system when the system was failing, and not from the owner's office, but from the queue. He set his carry-on down and placed both hands on the counter. He spoke to Zoe, not to Trevor. He said there was a corporate directory accessible from any property management terminal at her clearance level. Under it, there was an ownership registry. He asked her to open it, search the Harborstone Victoria, and trace the entry to the parent trust. He said there would be a name at the end of that trace. 2 clicks. That was all he was asking. Zoe looked at him. Trevor said inquiries about corporate ownership structure were not something that could be addressed at the front desk. Norman said he was asking for access to a directory he knew existed because he had built it. He said that last part quietly, and Trevor did not appear to register it. Celeste came forward from the concierge area. She said to the lobby in general rather than to Norman specifically that in her experience a person who refuses compensation and begins asking for access to internal corporate records is not looking for a room. A few guests near the luggage rack were watching. One had a phone at chest height. Norman did not turn around. He kept his hands on the counter and asked Zoe again to run the registry. The clock read 5:22. What Norman did not know was that Zoe had already run it. She had opened the directory 8 minutes earlier, while Trevor was still on his way down from the mezzanine. She had done it because a guest had stood at the end of her counter and named the exact tab in the exact internal language of the directory, and in 6 weeks as assistant manager, she had never once heard a guest use those words. She had thought, either this person has worked in hospitality operations, or they have a reason to know. She typed in the Harborstone Victoria and waited 4 seconds. The result came back in a plain text window with no formatting. The Harborstone Victoria, operating entity, Harborstone Properties Inc. Parent Company, Crestwood Hospitality Group, Holding Company, Pratt Capital Holdings, Beneficial Owner and Founder Natural Person, Norman R. Pratt, Kingston, Ontario. She read it twice. Then she looked at the man standing at the counter with the carry-on at his feet and the suit bag folded over the arm of the chair beside him, and she felt the floor of her working life tilt a few degrees in a direction she had not anticipated. She sent the entry as a compliance escalation to 2 addresses, the regional director and the Crestwood corporate duty line. Then she went back to closing out the afternoon's check-in manifest because that was the job in front of her, and she had been raised to finish what she started. In Vancouver, Dana Forsyth read the alert on her phone, said the words "say that again" to no one in particular, and stood up from her desk. She had been Crestwood's regional VP for 3 years. She had met Norman Pratt twice, once at a management off-site in Banff, and once during a site visit he had conducted in Halifax without announcing himself. And both times he had arrived in a pickup truck and departed without anyone who didn't already know him taking particular notice. She had signed a non-disclosure covering the ownership structure before she had signed her employment contract. She was on the phone with the Victoria property in 4 minutes. At 5:22, Trevor Alcott's tablet chimed. He looked at the screen. He read whatever was on it, looked up at the man at the counter, and read it again. The color left his face the way it leaves someone who has just understood the last 20 minutes from a completely different angle. He came around from behind the desk. He said, "Mr. Pratt." Everyone within 30 feet heard the register in which he said it. Norman told him he had a canceled reservation on room 408 and he would like it reinstated. Trevor reinstated it in the time it took to type 4 numbers, which was, Norman observed, approximately how long it had always needed to take. Celeste had heard Trevor's voice change. She came across the lobby and stood 8 feet away and looked at the man she had offered a dining credit to 40 minutes ago. She asked if it was true. Norman told her he owned the parent company, that the Harborstone was one of 11 properties under it, that he had booked a standard room 4 months ago because his daughter was getting married here on Saturday, and that was the only reason he was in Victoria. His phone rang. Dana's voice came through clearly enough that the people nearest caught most of it. The apology, the offer to initiate a review, the question of what he wanted done about the staff involved. He listened to all of it. Then he said nothing, not tonight. He said no one was to be suspended or spoken to on the floor. He said Celeste Vane's event could proceed as contracted on the 4th floor because her company had booked those rooms through the proper channels, and she had done what people with leverage generally do when leverage is available, which was use it, and that was not something to be addressed on a Thursday evening in a hotel lobby. He said the only thing he needed from the Harborstone in the next 30 minutes was the same thing his reservation had promised him 4 months ago. Dana said that was not adequate given what had occurred. Norman said memos could wait until Monday. He had a rehearsal dinner in 68 minutes and a suit to hang up. He picked up his carry-on. He was halfway to the elevator when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Abby standing in the middle of the lobby in a blue dress, her hair half-pinned, holding her phone with both hands and looking at him the way a person looks at something that is not what they expected. She had come down for something ordinary, a question for the florist, a correction to a seating chart, and had heard Trevor say her father's name in a particular register, and had heard enough of Dana's voice through the phone to piece together the shape of what she was standing in. She said, Norman. She had not said Dad since she was 16, which was when she had decided it sounded more serious. He asked her how the dress looked. She said it looked fine and that he needed to explain what was happening. They went out to the garden terrace on the south side of the building, which was empty at that hour. The harbor lay gray-green in the November light. Abby sat on the edge of a stone planter, and Norman sat beside her, and they looked at the water for a moment, because neither of them had ever started difficult conversations the same way twice. She asked him how many hotels. He said 11. 12 in about 8 months if the Edmonton build came in on schedule. She was quiet. Then she said she'd had student loans. She said she had spent 2 years in a basement apartment in Halifax eating rice and lentils, and that she had called him one September when she couldn't make rent, and he had sent her $200 and a list of places in the neighborhood that were hiring, and she had appreciated it. She had, but she needed to understand. Norman said yes. She waited. He said her mother had wanted it that way. He said Carol had been very specific. Let Abby earn her things. Let her know what things cost. Don't hand her a life she hadn't built, because the people handed lives often don't know what they're made of, and that matters later. He said Carol had told him this at the kitchen table in Kingston, with 3 weeks left on her prognosis, sitting up straight, absolutely calm about it, and he had not had any argument that seemed adequate. Abby said her mother had never told her any of that. Norman reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. It was sealed. Carol's handwriting was on the front. Abby, for when the time is right. He had carried it for 3 years. He had not opened it. He had not known until he was standing in the lobby of a hotel he owned watching his daughter put the pieces together alone when the time was right. She took it with both hands. She did not open it immediately. She held it and looked at it, and the light fell across the harbor behind her the way light does in Victoria in late autumn, low and even, and Norman thought of a photograph taken in a kitchen in Kingston that he still kept on his phone, of Carol sitting at the table with a cup of tea and the newspaper and nothing in particular happening. After a while, Abby said she wished her mother were here for this. Norman said so did he. She said she wasn't angry at him. She said she was going to need some time to understand it fully, but that she was not angry, and that was about all she could promise for right now. He said that was enough. She stood and looked at him the way daughters look at fathers when something has shifted and neither person is entirely sure in what direction. And then she said, "Go hang up your suit. You have a rehearsal dinner." The evening went the way those evenings go when the people around the table are glad to be there. Norman sat near Ben Nakamura's parents, who had driven up from Burnaby in a minivan, and they talked about the ferry crossing and the drive, and the kind of nothing that becomes the whole thing when you are sitting with people you are going to know for the rest of your life. Near the end of dinner, Ben leaned over and said quietly that he'd heard what had happened in the lobby. He said he hoped Norman wasn't bothered that Abby knew. Norman said it was past time. Ben said he had looked up Crestwood on his phone for about 10 minutes that afternoon before putting it away. He said it was a lot. Norman said it was a fair number of hotels, yes. Ben said that wasn't what he meant. He said it seemed like a company built on something, the way he could tell just from reading about it. He asked how it had started. Norman said it had started with a motel room outside Sudbury in 2005. He said the heating unit hadn't worked, and the sheets weren't clean, and the night manager had shrugged when he mentioned it, and Norman had driven home the next morning, thinking someone should do this properly. He had started the paperwork that same week. Ben sat with that, and then nodded and went back to his dinner, and Norman did the same. The memo that had been told to wait until Monday became a review that ran 11 weeks. Norman brought in an outside firm, gave them full access to every property record, and stated in writing that nothing was to be softened in the findings. What came back was not what he had hoped to read. The auditors identified 41 instances across 6 properties and 19 months in which a confirmed guest reservation had been canceled or downgraded within 8 hours of a request from an account flagged as high revenue. 32 had used a billing discrepancy code as justification. 8 involved guests traveling to be with a family member at a medical facility. The code had been designed to catch genuine payment irregularities. Nothing in the written policy required a duty manager to document why the code had been opened. Norman had approved that policy himself in 2019 on the advice of a compliance team managing chargeback liability. He read the relevant section 4 times. He wrote 3 words in the margin: "I missed this." The updated policy went out in March. A billing review flag could no longer be applied without a written reason logged at the moment of opening and a counter-signature from a second manager. A confirmed reservation could not be canceled to free inventory for a new booking under any circumstances. No exception for high-revenue corporate accounts. No exception for annual contracts. No exception for last-minute event blocks. Every override would appear in a quarterly board report and in a summary posted in the staff room of every property. Trevor Alcott was not terminated for what had happened in the lobby of the Harborstone Victoria. He was terminated for 11 prior instances across 2 years, in which the same billing code had been used to displace confirmed guests in favor of accounts whose business his regional contact wanted to preserve. The termination letter named the reason specifically, because Norman had insisted it be stated plainly. Zoe Whitman was promoted to front desk manager at the Harborstone 4 months later. 8 months after that, Crestwood created a new position at each property: guest rights coordinator, with the standing authority to reverse any duty manager's decision on a confirmed reservation. Zoe was offered the role and accepted. Norman wrote the nomination letter himself. He did not sign it as founder, he signed it as a guest. Celeste Vane contacted Norman through Sean in January with a request to meet. He agreed. She came to Kingston and sat in his kitchen and laid out what she had done, in order, without softening any part of it. She said she had spent 6 weeks looking at her company's own records and had found 7 occasions across 4 years, in which her office had made the same type of request at hotel and venue counters across the country, and she read those out as well. She arranged restitution to 5 of the 7 displaced guests who could be identified, and stepped back from a leadership role at her firm, while the remaining 2 were being located. Norman told her the accounting had been enough. She asked him before she left how he had stayed calm in the lobby. He said he had not been calm. He said calm and still were not the same thing, and that his wife had spent a long time teaching him the difference before she ran out of time to teach him anything else. The program was announced the following November. It was called the Steady Room Initiative, and it did 2 things. It designated a protected block of rooms at each Crestwood property that could not be released, adjusted, or reassigned for any reason under any account flag, and it established a fund covering those rooms at no charge for guests who were traveling to be with a family member receiving medical care nearby. Norman had insisted on the second part as much as the first. The money, he said at the internal launch to a room of property managers and regional directors, is the straightforward part. The hard part is making sure the room still exists when the person walks up to the counter with nothing but a bag and a reason. That part has to be structural. That part has to hold even when there's pressure, and even when the pressure has a name on a contract. The initiative moved 2,300 guests in its first year. Norman was not at the announcement. He was in Kingston. Abby called on the Sunday after the program appeared in a trade newsletter a colleague had forwarded her. She had not known it was his until she read to the 3rd paragraph. She said it was a good thing. He said he was glad she thought so. She said she was still reading the letter. She said there were parts of it she needed to sit with longer than others. He said her mother had been that way, that Carol had never rushed the things that mattered. Abby said she could see that now. They talked for a while about other things, the apartment in Vancouver, Ben's new position, a trip they were thinking of taking east in the spring. It was an ordinary call, the kind that is easily forgotten, which is the only kind that lasts. When they said goodbye, he set the phone on the kitchen table and sat in the quiet of the house for a few minutes. He did not think about the company. He thought about a motel room with a broken heater and a manager who shrugged, and the drive home in the dark with the idea forming that someone should do it properly. He thought about Carol at this table, straight-backed and calm about things no one should have to be calm about. He thought about an envelope held in both hands on a stone terrace above a gray-green harbor, in the light that comes at the end of a November afternoon in a city on the western edge of the country. There are people who need the whole room to know what they've built. Norman had understood for a long time what that need costs them. The thing you give up the moment you show your full hand is the ability to see clearly how other people play theirs. He had spent 18 years learning how the world treats a man who looks like he's retired from the trades, and he had gotten a clear enough answer. The only honest thing to do with an answer like that was to spend whatever working years remained making sure it came out differently for the next person standing at that counter. He was not finished, but he was closer than he had been.